The Cat's Eye Nebula can be a difficult object to shoot and develop. I shot this image a couple weeks ago during a night of a full moon, pretty much because I can't stand to have the telescope sitting idle on a clear night, even if there is a full moon, and it was a good opportunity to gather initial data. But right away you can see there is a problem with this image, apart from the moonlight that is making the background overbright and uneven. If we compare my image of the cat's eye on the left to a NASA image of the cat's eye on the right, there is a colorful core in the center of the Cat's Eye Nebula. In fact, what is portrayed in my image as greenish on the left is an outer nebula or halo surrounding the planetary nebula at the core of the Cat's Eye. And in the very heart of the core, there is a rare Wolf-Rayet star. These stars are extremely hot and extremely bright, and the core nebula greatly outshines the outer nebula. So much so that when the image is developed to show the outer nebula, as in on the left, the core gets lost in its own brightness. Now I can easily develop for that core and bring it out of the image, but then we entirely lose the outer nebula. The quandary is how to get them both. This image was shot on a 203mm Celestron SCT using LRGB filters on a Player One Aries M camera and 60-second exposures, short enough not to overexpose the core. The data was gathered on 2 nights. One night had a full moon, but very good seeing. The other night had no moon and initially seemed great, but it was a night of terrible seeing, which we'll get into shortly. Well, let's go ahead and dive in. I'll just start out by saying that on the moonless night that I gathered half the data for this image, there was great transparency, but the seeing was one of the worst nights I've ever experienced. The stars were twinkling furiously, and in PhD2 they jumped all over the place, often taking the guiding between about 0.5 to moments later 4.0. In PhD2 I normally control guiding with predictive PEC and run exposures of around 2.0 seconds. But to compensate for this wild seeing, I switched the guiding to hysteresis and decreased the exposure time to 0.5 seconds. It didn't make the guiding good, but it did reduce the error down to about an average of 1.4. And happily, later on during the night, sometime after midnight, the seeing calmed down, and when I woke up to check on the telescope at around 2 a.m., guiding was once again averaging a pretty typical 0.6 to 0.7. Also, shooting short 60-second frame subs helped a lot with this wild night. But the wild guiding meant this whole development procedure had to start off with some calling of subs. That was done in PixInsight's subframe selector, where I used the number of stars counted as the standard and had the subframe selector call everything beyond the second standard deviation of sharpness. Anyway, coping with the bad tracking and using the subframe selector is a topic for the next video, so we will get back to that. In this video, we're going to stay focused on the developing. At the end of a night of battling with bad seeing, I ended up with data on luminance, red, green, and blue channels. You can see them here: upper left luminance, upper right red, lower left green, lower right blue. Each of these images has been given a shorthand identifier, LRGB, to make them easier to work with in the development tools. No operations have yet been performed on the information, so the first thing to do is run star alignment. I'll open the star alignment tool and set the luminance channel as our master, which will be the standard upon which the red, green, and blue positions will be based. And then, in the tick boxes of the Add Views option, I'll select the RGB channels, click the circle icon to execute the operation on all the data, and star alignment will do its thing. In a moment, we'll get 3 new images, each with the suffix registered, designating that they have been aligned to line up perfectly with the luminance channel. Once they appear on the screen, I'll just put each of the channels in position and use the screen transfer function to make their images show. Now, before any further operations are done, I'm going to merge the red, green, and blue channels. This will allow the information from those channels to be brought together in a color balance way, and then I can run spectrophotometric color calibration on the output. Now, I will note here that I don't always do things this way. Sometimes I will custom adjust the histogram on each channel before I merge them. And oftentimes I'll experiment. I'll run iterations where I do customized histogram and curve stretches of various kinds just to see what the best outcomes are. Alright, the channel combination tool has given us our output RGB channel, and we can see that the color is off. That's not a big deal. It's pretty common when we merge the channels. So the next thing to do is run Image Solver so that we can then run spectrophotometric color calibration on the image. After Image Solver and spectrophotometric color calibration have been run, we get a color-balanced RGB outcome. I can now minimize the individual RGB registered channels and get them out the way. The lower right corner is where I put things that I don't think I'm going to need anymore. In the processing of an image, I don't like to delete anything until I'm done. You never know when something might come in handy in further processing. But now the situation is simplified as we only have to work on a combined RGB channel and a luminance channel. However, this is where things also get somewhat complicated, because on the RGB combined and the luminance channels, I'm going to have to develop this information twice. Once to develop out the very bright core nebula, and then again to develop out the surrounding outer nebula. Now I want to focus on the cat's eye nebula only, so I can crop most of the rest of the image out of there. And this is going to come in handy because we're going to have to run several time-consuming processes over and over again, including multiple uses of Blur Exterminator using different settings to maximize its benefits to the image. So cropping out much of the image is tantamount to removing a great deal of information that Blur Exterminator will have to operate on, meaning that Blur Exterminator, Noise Exterminator, and Star Exterminator, which are the most time-consuming operations, can run much more quickly. The crop on the luminance channel needs to be the exact same as that conducted on the RGB combined channel, and that's easily done by using dynamic crop. I define the area that I'll crop on the RGB combined channel, drag the process icon, that triangle on its side, over to the luminance channel. It crops the luminance channel to the coordinates designated on the RGB combined channel, and then I press the check mark on the dynamic crop tool, and that will execute the crop on the RGB combined channel. Now, let's get to developing out that core. I'm going to remove the screen transfer function from the image so that we can see the core. With the screen transfer function, the core is just blown out by its own brightness. The next thing I'm going to do is run the Blur Exterminator on the RGB combined channel to help define some of the structure within the core. Now I don't want the Blur Exterminator to confuse any of these very tiny details for stars, so I drag the Sharpen Star slider all the way to 0. Then I'll execute the Blur Exterminator by dragging the process icon onto the RGB combined image. Blur Exterminator, it's amazing software, and when it's done, we can begin to see the detail within the inner core. The next step is to run a histogram stretch customized for the core. I'm going to drag up the leftmost icon just to the beginning of the left side of the light curve to establish our black point, and then I'm going to drag up the middle icon just enough to help define the brightness within the core, making sure that the brightness does not become so overwhelming that we lose any of the delicate detail within. Now it's time to switch to the Curves tool, which is going to give much more refined control of this operation. I'll start again by making a preview window and selecting a sample at the very center of the preview window so that we can get close to that core and get a good impression of what's going on with the Curves tool. Now the first thing I want to do is develop out the color within the core, so I'm going to have to operate on the individual color channels. There's a lot of blue in this channel, so I'll begin by emphasizing the red. And when the reds hidden within the image are showing, I'll emphasize the blues to further enrich them and bring them out of the image. Then I'll slightly de-emphasize the green channel, which will further allow the blues and reds to stand out. And it will also help the dark spaces within the core nebula to stand out. Finally, an adjustment of the luminance channel will control overall brightness and help some contrast to show through. The next thing I'm going to do is run the Blur Exterminator again. This time, I'm going to let it run on the color and luminance within the RGB combined channel, but I've increased its Sharpen Non-Stellar function to 0.60. This will allow the Blur Exterminator to execute a little bit more sharpening than normal within the image, strictly on the nebulous material in there. Now I'll run the Noise Exterminator and see if that improves the image any, but in the end, its saturation clipped some of the color, especially in the blues. So I undid the Noise Exterminator and did not run that at all. And now we have a satisfactory finished image of the core of the Cat's Eye Nebula. I'll save this as a TIFF for later processing in Affinity Photo. Now, using the RGB core as a model, we're going to address the core within the heart of the luminance channel. That begins by turning off the screen transfer function and scrolling in so that we can see the core of the luminance channel clearly. Once again, I'm going to run the Blur Exterminator with the Sharpen Star slider turned all the way to 0, this time on the luminance channel, to do an initial refinement of the detail hidden away within that channel. Then I'll run a histogram transformation on the luminance channel using the exact same theory that I applied to the RGB combined channel. The The leftmost icon will be moved to the beginning of the light curve to establish a black point, and the middle icon will be moved up just enough to bring out the detail within the core. Once the histogram is run, I'll refine the luminance and contrast with a quick curves transformation. The general idea is to keep the darker regions low without allowing the brightest regions to become blown out, and this will emphasize the detail hidden away within the core nebula. There are many possible ways this can be accomplished, and I don't think there is one best way. But finding the curves that work for you is an iterative process, so also don't be afraid to experiment. If you don't like the outcome, you can always hit that reset button and try again. If there are multiple outcomes, each of which you think you like, just clone your image and start all over again. Having found what I feel is a pretty good curves transformation for the luminance channel, I'm going to run the blur exterminator again, this time on default settings, and let the blur exterminator make a great deal of adjustment. The outcome looks good, but now I'm going to do something I ordinarily would never do. I'm going to run the blur exterminator yet again. This is because I'm working with very small detail hidden deep within that image. The inner core is so small, it almost looks like a bright star within the image. And I want to do everything I can to maximize the detail hidden within, and in particular, minimize the blurriness. So another run of the blur exterminator should do it. This outcome looks good. Now it's time to merge the luminance channel with the RGB combined channel by way of the LRGB combination tool. To use this tool, I'll leave the luminance checkbox clicked, but unclick the RGB boxes, and then drag the process icon over on top of the RGB combined channel. This will add the luminance data to the RGB data. Adding the luminance data has the desired effect of increasing apparent contrast and sharpness within the image. Now I'm going to further refine the outcome with another fine-tuned curves adjustment. And then I'm going to enhance sharpness one last time with the blur exterminator, but this time I'll turn down the sharpen non-stellar slider to 0.25, just to apply a little bit of sharpening to the core nebula and refine some of the apparent detail hidden away within. This looks very good. I'm going to save this as a lossless TIFF for final adjustments and merging in Affinity Photo in a few minutes. Now it's time to deal with the outer, much dimmer region of the Cat's Eye Nebula. To do this, I'm going to undo all the changes that I've made except for the dynamic crop and zoom back out. Now, on both the luminance and the RGB combined channels, I'm going to run the blur exterminator in the correct only mode. The seeing was absolutely terrible on the night that I shot this image, and this will help correct any aberrations that may have appeared in the stars. Since the stars are right at the very center of the image, this should be relatively minor, but it never hurts to do this. After blur exterminator correct only is run on both the L and the RGB combined channels, I'll now run blur exterminator at the default settings on both channels to sharpen up the nebula structure and deconvolve the stars. Next, the star exterminator is run on both the luminance and the RGB combined channels. I'm going to discard the stars from the luminance channel, they'll just be too bright. But I will keep the stars from the RGB combined channel. They will have a nice color to add to the final image and a nice brightness, without being overwhelming to the image. Though, as this image was heavily cropped, the stars will need to be reduced. I'll show you how when we hit Affinity Photo. Because this image has been very much cropped, Star Exterminator will go relatively quickly, but when it's done, it reveals a problem. Remember how I had mentioned that the core nebula of the Cat's Eye was so small it could be confused with a star? Well, Star Exterminator has confused much of that luminance for a star. And this is why I did not run the Star Exterminator on the image when I was doing the initial processing for the core nebula only. That lost light is information. In this case though, since I'm now processing to bring out the outer nebula of the Cat's Eye, I can let this error by Star Exterminator stand. And besides, that information or light will be added back to the core when the star plate is merged with the image when I get everything into Affinity Photo. Now I want to save this exact level of histogram stretch to the star plate. So I'll click and drag the tab of the RGB star plate to the right, creating a clone of the star plate. Open up the screen transfer function window, select the original star plate, and this will reveal the histogram stretch on the screen transfer function. And then I'll drag the process icon from the screen transfer function onto the process icons of the histogram transformation tool. When you have the process icon from the screen transfer function tool over the right spot of the histogram transformation tool, an hourglass will appear beside the mouse cursor. You can let go at this point, and the information from the screen transfer tool will be transferred to the histogram transformation tool. Then just drag the process icon from the histogram transformation tool onto the starplate clone. The starplate clone will then acquire the exact histogram stretch that was done on the original starplate by the screen transfer function. Then I'll shrink the original starplate and put it in the garbage lower right and use the clone. And save the starplate clone as a lossless TIFF to be later used in Affinity Photo. Finally, histogram stretches are run on the now starless luminance and RGB combined channels. After the histogram stretches, Noise Exterminator is run on both to clean them up. And after Noise Exterminator has done its thing, a customized curves transformation to maximize luminance and contrast and sharpness and color is run on both the luminance and the RGB combined channels. Then the LRGB combination tool is run. Just as before, the luminance channel is selected as the primary, the RGB boxes are turned off, and the process icon is dragged over the RGB combined channel to add the luminance to the RGB combined channel. With the LRGB information finally combined in the outer region of the nebula, a final curves transformation is run to tease the most out of the information available. This shot would really be better with another day or two of information because the outer nebula of the cat's eye is just so dim, but you work with what you have. And after the curves tool is run, I'll run the blur exterminator one more time, this time having it operate on the luminance channel only to minimize the chance of any artifacts cropping up in the information. The outcome is saved as a lossless TIFF, and it too will be transferred over to Affinity Photo for final processing. We're finally operating in Affinity Photo. Here, the outer region of the cat's eye nebula will become the background. Following standard procedure, I'll duplicate the background and make the original locked and invisible. This preserves the original as a sort of proof layer should we need to fall back to it in case of errors or if the information should be useful further on in the developing process. On top of this, I'm going to drag the image of the core nebula. The images were pre-aligned and cropped in PixInsight, so in Affinity Photo by using the snap tool, everything will snap perfectly into place over each other. Then I'm going to drag the image of the core nebula beneath the duplicate of the outer nebula, and then with the outer nebula or background layer selected, I'll erase out the blown out core of the background layer, revealing the core nebula beneath. Now I like this, but the transition from the outer nebula to the core nebula is unnatural. This needs to be adjusted so that the one fades into the other better. However, before I even do that, I want to improve the signal-to-noise ratio of the overall image because the outer nebula, as you can see, is quite dim. And the way I'm going to do this is by ortonizing the outer nebula. You may be familiar with the Orton effect. It was a technique to introduce a gleaming, dreamy landscape that was created way back in the 1980s in the days of chemical photography. It was later adapted to digital photography when digital photography came about. If you're interested in mastering the technique, check out my video, Ortonize It. The Orton effect, when applied to astrophotography correctly, has a way of improving the apparent signal-to-noise ratio. Not the true signal-to-noise ratio, but the apparent one, or another way of putting it is that it can strengthen the appearance of dim or weak structures. So the way I'm going to implement this technique here is I'm going to duplicate the background layer and set the new duplicate for a screen composite. The screen composite lays the light and color information it contains over the layer below. The formula is not purely additive. It will add to the overall luminance without leading to hypersaturation. Then I'll duplicate the background layer again. And to this new duplicate, I'm going to add the soft light composite mode. Soft light will draw down the darkest regions a bit while adding luminance and saturation information to the rest of the image. It's somewhat like the screen composite mode, except it will draw down the darker regions a bit, creating some contrast in the darker areas. Soft light can have a strong effect, however, so I'm going to change this layer's opacity to 46%. Now it's time to bring in the star plate. We can just drag it right out of the Explorer and into Affinity Photo, where it will become a new layer at the top of all the other layers. Then, so the stars can show over the image, I'll change the composite mode to screen. This will make the dark regions transparent and add any light information in the star layer to the image. In fact, as you can see, the light at the core of the star layer has somewhat burned out or blown out the core of the nebula. However, that's easily rectified. I'll just erase out the center of the star layer. So with the star layer selected, I'll pass the erase tool over it. The erase tool is set for 100 flow and opacity, but 0% hardness so that its changes merge softly with the surroundings of the nebula. And this will allow the core of the nebula to show through once again. Now the stars themselves look large in this image. They aren't actually bloated, they're just enlarged because we crop so much of the image with the stars. But I want to shrink the stars so they fit in more naturally and are less dominating of the image. That's easily accomplished with the Curves tool. With the star layer selected, I'll open up a Curves tool. This way the Curves tool will open up in the star layer and affect only the star layer. And with the Curves tool set for RGB on the master channel, I'll grab the curve at about a quarter from the bottom and drag it sideways, which will shrink the stars. This type of maneuver on the Curves tool is sometimes called creating an inverse C-curve. That looks good. I feel the stars fit into the image much better now. Now I want to strengthen the outer nebula structure of the cat's eye, so in each of the orthogonized background layers, I'm going to add a Curves tool and make a modified S-curve to enhance the brightness of the cat's eye structure while keeping the darkness about where it is. Now we're very close to done. I do have that data that I shot from about 2 or 3 weeks ago during the full moon of March. It's a full moon shot and it's not the best, but information is information. I'm going to add this information to the image. And in this case, I'm going to do so directly in Affinity Photo. I'll just drag the file directly into Affinity Photo, select the layer, and drag the file till it's aligned right over roughly the image. Set the file to a screen composite so I can see through it and continue the rough alignment, starting by rotating the March 23 image. And then, when I have it roughly in place, switching to the contrast negate composite method, which will make the overlying image dark and the underlying image bright so that the stars work like bullseyes. At this point, I can align them right down to the pixel. It's a quick, easy, manual way to align stars. There, we're about done. And yeah, there's our alignment. Once the alignment is done, I can switch this layer to the screen composite mode so that the March 23 information adds its lights and saturation information to all the layers below. I don't want it to further brighten up the stars, so I'll just use the erase tool on the layer to delete out the empty space. It does make me think though, I'm going to have to try combining this information in PixInsight by various methods sometime and see if one of those methods allows me to pull even more detail out of the old information. But for now, this will do. And I like in particular the way adding the new layer creates a more natural transition between the cat's eye's outer nebula and the core nebula at its center. There are just a few final things to do here. As I spent so much time pulling the detail out of the core nebula, I want to show it off a little. So I'm going to make a zoom box or a display box for it to go into. It's easy enough to do. I'll click on the shape tool and select the rectangle, shift drag the rectangle so that it remains perfectly square, and make it a little bit bigger than the core nebula. I'll put that layer at the very top so it shows on top of everything else, and then drag a duplicate of the core nebula layer to inside the box. This is how you crop layers in Affinity Photo. With the duplicate core layer selected, I can then drag it to about roughly directly center of the box. And with the duplicate layer of the core nebula still selected, I can grab any corner of it and shift drag it to effectively blow it up, making it larger within the box. Then I can select the box layer and drag it over to a corner of the image, so it's in view, but out of the way of the beautiful cat's eye nebula. And I can click any corner of the box and shift drag it as well, which will proportionately enlarge both the box and the layer within it, effectively magnifying the core nebula within. There, I like that. That looks good. However, I felt at this point that I could bring more sharpness into the final image. So I won't drag you through all the boring details, but I went back to the original data and I called the data much more aggressively, removing maybe 2% more of the information from the night of the full moon, but a full 55% of the information from the night of the really bad seeing. Then I combined, processed, and developed that information using the exact same steps you've seen so far, which yielded a much sharper final image of the cat's eye nebula. And by calling the data much more aggressively, we got this image on the right. And as you can see, I've also applied a color balance to it, bringing out the natural blues in this nebula and de-emphasizing that green look. And to really showcase that beautiful core nebula, I also developed a mid-range luminosity layer. To show the outer parts of the central core better, it has structure within it, layers upon layers, as the dying Wolf-Rayet star throws off mass every 1500 years. And finally, after completing that more aggressive call of the subs, I decided to leave the galaxy NGC 6552 in the image. The more aggressive call allowed me to refine the image of the galaxy into something a little bit more detailed than just a bright football. And I think, with that, I'm done developing this image, at least until I get a clear night of excellent seeing, where I can keep the SCT set at maximum focal length trained on the cat's eye all night. At which point, I might be able to bring out more of the interesting detail of the core of the cat's eye and the surrounding bright luminosity. I hope you enjoyed watching this video as much as I enjoyed making it, and hopefully learned something or maybe have some constructive criticism or observations on your own techniques. If so, feel free to leave them in the comments below, and thanks for coming along. Now get out there and shoot the sky.